on my website. Bye. Hi, welcome to the poetry vlog. Today I'm going to work so hard, as I forget to turn off notifications, to keep it under 10 minutes. So first I have a couple quick announcements and updates because we're still in the sort of documentation process of how to make this stuff work. And then I'm going to move into examples of how to do a close reading through the basic tenets of textual analysis. So if you're like, fuck no, did I ever go to AP English? Or like, why would I take college writing? If I teach you the basics of textual analysis, you'll be shocked at how much it applies to any type of analysis and how much you can make convincing arguments about things that like might not even be right, but they're convincing. And you get the A in the class, or you're really convincing at a work meeting, all sorts of things. So that's the value I have to offer today, as promised, per the other day's post if you listen to the coda at the end of the Kendrick Lamar one. So I'm assuming this video will get fewer views because I'm doing a much more niche author this time. I'm doing Zamora Linmark. It's actually a novel, technically, rolling the R's. I argue in my dissertation, though, that it's another example of a poetry text that doesn't get read as poetry, but if you read it as poetry, as in you have like a sort of hyper-attention to the languageness of it and the imagery and the different ways you could interpret the words, as opposed to sort of closed ways of interpreting words, you can get more out of the text. And in future vlogs, I'm sure I'll address that in more detail. I firmly believe, and you'll see this over and over again in this, that the reason I'm offering you poetry is the value here, because let me pause for a second. Let me think of the best way to put it so that I don't just rush headlong into that. I think what poetry has to offer across all genres, and thinking of texts as poetic, so like the Beyonce music video, the Kendrick Lamar song, right, this fiction book, theoretically, is that poetry opens up to multiple interpretations and definitions, right? It doesn't necessarily have a singular closed meaning. And I think once folks get comfortable with hearing that poetry doesn't have to have one meaning, instead it can open up to many meanings depending on your analysis skills, there's a really huge freedom that comes with that. And it also can change the way you start hearing songs like by Kendrick Lamar, for instance, or the ways that you read Beyonce's Lemonade, or all these other texts that we encounter every day. And it's really powerful to start seeing how many different ways you can interpret something if you have the right tools in your toolkit. So that's the main direction that we're going and why we're focusing on the basics today. The other reason we're focusing on the basics today is actually because of my own personal lesson. So if we're doing a documentation style versus production style, right? I'm just kind of talking to you like I would talk to any of my friends today. This morning, I usually go to like a 6 a.m.-ish boxing class, and I've been doing that for a couple of years now. I've gotten pretty into it. I manage their social media lately, so it's the Boxing Gym West Side if you're curious to check them out. Maybe sometimes I'll post like videos or photos and start a channel here so you can keep up with the boxing too. I love it, but I also love it because it's so rich in metaphors, right? And this morning, I went into class and I really realized that my jab, I've been doing it wrong for a while. For those of you who don't know, the jab is the first punch you learn how to throw, and I just did it wrong right there. You shouldn't have your elbow come up. You have to have it go just straight. And I have a really hard time with that. I have a hard time with it because of how my body is. Like I have some issues with my traps. I have an issue with it because I've been training it wrong for the last year or two, so it's not the right muscle memory. And it can be frustrating because it's the very first baby step outside of moving forwards and backwards. It's like the first punch you ever learn. So of course there's that moment where you're like, man, I've got to relearn my first punch that I ever learned, and I have to just work on ones and twos for like, who knows, the foreseeable future, right? And it's easy to get down on yourself. It's like, oh my God, like this is just never going to end. But it actually reminded me of writing. I still have to go back to the basics over and over and over. I'm writing a dissertation, I have papers published, I have a manuscript done, all these different things. Still have to go back to the basics of analysis every single time. So I'm doing this for myself as much as for you. Actually, which is it's not about memorizing information, it's about how you read information. That's really important. That's a key difference. That's what's beautiful about the humanities. It's less about rote remembering of facts, and it's more about learning how to really analyze and understand text and how to read. So we're going to go back to the 1-2s, so to speak, so the jab cross, right, of English literature, and just go to the basics of textual analysis, and I'll practice doing one in front of you with a text that I haven't analyzed before. So you'll see me in my what's called recursive state, meaning I'll say one thing and I'll contradict it and be like, never mind, I take it back. I should say this instead, which is basically just revising as I go because I'm talking to you. I'm not writing an essay where I can go back and delete. So you get to kind of experience that as well. Poetry. Because I really want to argue to the world that poetry is not exclusive to the world of poetry, right? It's everywhere, and it's just about how you read text. Many poets would argue with me on this. They're totally welcome to do that, but I feel this really firmly. And I think when the dominant culture starts to see that, you're going to see a change in how we think about knowledge, and how we think about knowledge changes, how we think about each other changes. We might move towards more like ethical relationships with one another. I'd say empathetic, but another vlog someday will explain my resistance to the use of empathetic pedagogies, is what it's called. All right, let me double check. I took a couple notes on things I didn't want to forget. No, that's the majority of it. All right, I'm at 8 minutes already. So I'm going to read the selection for you. I'm only going to read part of the selection for the sake of time, and then I'm going to break down an interpretation of it. So this book is technically a novel called Rolling the R's by Zamora Linmark. I love it. I read it in my queer theory class, like 3 or 4 years ago now. I'm writing about it in my dissertation, and it's an incredible story of a bunch of young kiddos in Hawaii who have various different immigrant or native descents, but in particular, it's focused on Edgar, who is Filipino and really struggles with assimilation narratives and like the violence of assimilation and the violence of language, fiction making, the like pressure to become the proper American citizen, the model minority, properly assimilated, all of these different violences. And in particular, what I love about it is it looks at it through the lens of language and teaching language. And something else I think poetry offers the world is not non-normative grammar. So thinking grammar less as a set of rules that you must follow to be legible, and instead thinking of grammar as a set of tools you can tweak and bend and move around within to create meaning. So 2 different approaches to grammar, right? So the poem I'm focusing on, I'm calling it a poem because many of the chapters in here actually found texts from like mixing up song lyrics, right? Or lesson plans or things like that from the classroom, is The Sentencing of Lives, or Why Edgar Almost Failed Mrs. Takimoto's Class. And what follows then is it's a list of vocabulary words where they had to give a definition. There's 20 words, and then for each one, Edgar has to fill in a definition. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read the whole chapter or every single definition, though I'd strongly recommend reading this book, especially actually if you don't usually like poetry. It's just a good book. It's fascinating. But what Edgar's struggling with is the test said no pigeon allowed, right? So no sort of like hybrid language mixes allowed on this exam, which limits the meaning. And Edgar turns this on its head and instead expands what these different words could mean by inserting like the very personal experience of the word and the feelings that it can register, right? And this is a sort of like talking back at education models that refuse to acknowledge and validate and serve forms of subjugated knowledge or colonized knowledges, right? So I'll read just the first 2 as an example, and then I'm going to close read just the title of it on its own. I could write a whole book on like this one chapter, and you'll see why in a minute. All right, so 1, nostalgia, noun. I get all nostalgia when I listen to Yvonne Elements, If I Can't Have You, Andy Gibbs, Our Love, Don't Throw It Away, and Auntie Dionne's I'll Never Love This Way Again. 2, elegy, noun. Tragedy, an elegy included in the Bee Gees album Spirits Having Flown, hit the #1 spot in both Billboard's pop singles and adult contemporary charts. And I do the third one too. 3, misinterpret, verb. Katrina and I started buying Song Hits magazine because we misinterpret a lot of Bee Gees songs, and so forth. You get the idea. And as you go through them, the different characters' stories come out. So we're going to focus on the basics of text analysis. I'm actually going to even micro version this lesson plan to the first couple of steps, right? The sentencing of lives, comma, or why Edgar almost failed Mrs. Takemoto's class. The first thing you do is you just jot down observations. This might seem obvious, but it's actually not, right? So if I were to say the sentencing of lives is him describing lives being sentenced to death, that's actually not a fact. That's an assumption that I'm making. It's an assumption because I have yet to support it with proper observations. This is really crucial. I've been teaching undergrad writing for about a decade at least. Students do this all the time. They jump to interpretation, and that's being generous. It's actually an assumption. You could even blow this up to the way we think about each other and culture at large, right? We make assumptions all day long. We interpret things based on what we already think it means because of a preset idea about what we're looking for. That's an assumption, right? It can also be really violent, something we do to each other all the time. You see a person, you make an assumption about who they are and what they do in the world. And those assumptions are based on observations in the back of your mind that you haven't actually spelled out, right? So the assumption, the sentencing of lives, that first phrase is saying like the sentencing of lives, meaning like sentencing lives to death as an adjurical, blah, 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 right? That's the assumption. It's an educated assumption. It's kind of an interpretation based on my observation that sentencing as a verb is what's used to describe what's happening to the lives. That might seem really obvious. You're like, why would I have to spell that out? I'm about to show you why you have to spell that out. Because when you say that, sentencing as a verb describes what happens to the lives. Well, I'd be like, well, what else can sentence mean if it's not a verb? Right? And one of the things they had to do is they had to form complete sentences for each definition, right? So suddenly the word sentencing could interpretively fold out two different ways, right? The other way it could be is a pun on like the sentencing of lives is being tied to the way that lives have to make themselves legible through proper sentences, right? And this is based on my observation that sentencing is being used as a verb, which then if I take it a few steps back, I'm like, what is sentencing if not a verb? It's a sentence. What else can a sentence be? And so forth, right? That's just the first phrase. That right there is a whole paragraph in one of your final essay exams, easily. I think I did that actually once or twice, multiple times, right? And then we have comma, or why Edgar almost failed Mrs. Takemoto's class. So my observation here is that why Edgar, or why Edgar, means it's interchangeable with it, right? And that it's also saying that this is going to be an explanation why Edgar almost failed, so he didn't, which is also information, Mrs. Takemoto's class. Another observation I have is that Mrs. Takemoto, that's a Japanese name. So then we can also start thinking about immigration narratives and Japanese assimilation in Hawaii, which is another conversation for a not 20-minute vlog, right? But one observation that I would make that could go with this is, or why Edgar almost failed Mrs. Takemoto's class. My assumption when I first read it is that this is just a poem about how he messed up, right? Because he almost failed. But when I pair this observation with the observation I made before, it's actually saying that failing these classes becomes a way of not just sentencing you to the school or prison pipeline or to death, but also how language is wrapped up in that process of failure or success. We could go on from there about colonization, about different ways that the U.S. English language has been used as a sort of violent mechanism, and so forth. And you can really dig into each definition that he outlines within the chapter or poem, right? And you can talk about the different ways that that plays out in a more concrete, particular fashion, right? Like, why does the use of the pop songs become a noun as nostalgia, right? How does that function, and so forth? But the main thing I want to highlight today is you should always start with observations. Always. I make this mistake. It's a rookie mistake. I do it in probably almost all of these vlogs. You start with the object. You talk about what you're observing. You defamiliarize or make those observations less than what you've already interpreted them as, and then you reinterpret them. And sometimes it'll confirm what you originally assumed. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes it'll counter your assumption. Sometimes it'll complicate it. Even if your assumption's proven correct, at least now you have evidence to support it with. So if someone's like, I don't agree with your interpretation of that, you can say, okay, cool, what are your observations that support your interpretation? So on that note, I'm wrapping up. Feel free in the comments below to say you don't agree with my interpretation, right? You can tell me all the reasons that you don't. I would say back it up with your own observations. And if you do, awesome. I'm open to multiple interpretations, and I'd love to hear how you interpret these things. So that would actually be really great. And then the final shout out I want to give is a couple different links. First of all, I did an analysis lesson plan on performance arts with Naomi Macalalad Bragin, sorry. Naomi is an amazing choreographer, hip-hop artist, scholar, dance instructor that I've gotten to work with a lot in the last year. So I'm going to link to her bio down below so that you can also check out her her work. If you're interested in taking classes here in Seattle, I would strongly recommend her if this sort of analysis is up your alley and you want to learn hip hop, right? Though we can get into another thing about how is it hip hop really if it's in an academic classroom, which Naomi would get into with you. And then I also want to let you know that I'm linking from now on in my videos to my Instagram, my Twitter, but not my Facebook yet. I just don't like Facebook. I'm not on board yet, but I will get there. Just not yet. But I'm officially opening that up to my students, to you, to whoever. So again, go through the little description section down here, subscribe to my channel. I might start adding different playlists, including my boxing or other parts of my life that supplement my analysis and what I have to offer here. And I am very interested in hearing any questions that you want me to address. And again, future posts, I'm going to start featuring specifically questions from my students or fellow colleagues. So I'm happy to talk about whatever content will really help you get the most out of this. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully today, even though I did not even close to stick at 10 minutes, I went 8 minutes over, gave you an idea of how you can start doing textual analysis and making arguments. Even if it's as simple as next time someone tries to argue with you on Facebook, you'll have a little bit of a toolkit to fall back on. All right, on that note, have a wonderful day, and I will post another video tomorrow.